Hello students, welcome to the MOOC course Political Economy 2. The topic for our discussion today is imperialism. When we try to explore the concept of imperialism, we find that it basically gravitates around the idea of domination. Domination exercised by a more powerful country over a less powerful one. As a concept, it seeks to explain a special kind of political reality. History abounds in instances of empire building through conquest and domination by a more powerful country over one which is less. Imperialism therefore thus denotes a relationship of a ruling or a controlling power to those under domination. Lichtheim puts it as imperialism is the relationship of domination and subjugation, which is the essence of every regime. It basically denotes the extension of power through conquest or the pursuit of empires, that is, of a global influence which is so dominant as to amount to virtual sovereignty wherever it is successful. We come across numerous definitions offered by scholars on the phenomenon of imperialism. Professor Schumann considers it as the imposition of foreign rule over a country through aggressive or aggression. By imperialism, Burns refers to any situation in which one government is able to govern a number of nations or nationalities simultaneously through a consolidated legal system. H.G. Wells views imperialism as any attempt on part of a self-conscious nation-state to extend its influence on a worldwide scale through overt or covert means. According to Morgenthau, imperialism refers to territorial expansion of any state beyond its original territorial jurisdiction. But the Marxist perspective on the concept of imperialism is somewhat different. According to Kautsky, imperialism refers to the inclination on part of the industrialized nations to increasingly take hold of the agrarian country. Lenin argued when imperialism reaches its monopoly stage, that is, when capital gets concentrated and centralized, it reaches the stage of imperialism. In fact, Lenin considered this imperialism to be an inevitable stage of monopoly capitalism. Offering the first Marxist analysis of modern imperialism, Lenin distinguishes modern imperialism from the old by pointing out that the special feature of modern imperialism was the export of capital rather than the export of commodities, a desire for new investments rather than new markets for goods. Let us therefore see the factors which were responsible for old-style imperialism. 1. We can refer to aggressive or perverted nationalism. Imperialism has often emerged as a response to the so-called noble duty of civilizing and uplifting the backward nations undertaken by the advanced and civilized one from time to time. Such a responsibility on part of a civilized nation has been more often than not spurred by a sense of national pride or aggressive nationalism, which inculcates a sense of false superiority within a nation and induces it to look down upon all others as inferior. Instances are not far to seek. India's occupation by Great Britain or Hitler's preaching of the superiority of the German race are all examples of such aggressive or perverted nationalism. Britain's imperialists sought to justify imperialism through Christian missionaries who gave currency to the notion that the British or the whites were the most advanced races and therefore took upon themselves the noble duty of civilizing people who are backward, and that is what we generally understand as the concept of the white man's burden. So what are the factors leading to imperialism apart from aggressive or perverted nationalism? We find that often countries find it necessary to occupy another country to accommodate a rising population. A clear example is the colonization of America by Great Britain. There could also be the reason of occupying areas of strategic importance. The big powers have always indulged in an imperial policy for the purpose of exerting control or influence over the areas of strategic importance. The United States occupation of Diego Garcia and its conversion into a military base is a case in point. there could be an ideological reason also behind imperialism. Some scholars believe that imperialism may have emerged from the desire to expand influence on the ideological front. Imperialism on part of the US sought in good measure to check the tide of communism. This has been brought forth more clearly by America's intrusion in the internal affairs of Vietnam, Cambodia, or Laos. Perhaps an important explanation of imperialism is to be found in the economic reason. Modern political scientists in general and Marxist scholars in particular consider that economic interests lie at the heart of imperialism. The Industrial Revolution in England led to the production of goods on a large scale, and the capitalists were in the quest for larger markets. In their quest for these larger markets, they established colonies which also acted as perennial sources of raw materials to feed their industries at home. Imposition of political control over the colonies enabled the capitalists to escape competition from other industrialized nations. Imperialism, therefore, contends Lenin, emerged as the development and direct continuation of the fundamental characteristics of capitalism in general. So what is the chief characteristic of colonialism? The chief characteristic is that it established a relationship of inequality between the colonial and the metropolitan countries. The latter turned into mere suppliers of raw materials and cheap labor and enriched themselves. India thus became an agricultural appendage of Great Britain subsequent to her colonization. The colonial ideology, apart from subjugating the people, also propagated the notion of intellectual superiority of the white man, which we have already referred to as the white man's burden. Western education became a vehicle of promoting this idea, and missionaries who controlled education, we see this particularly in Africa, became an important instrument of colonial power. The psychological relationship between the colonizers and the colonized as superior and inferior created a rather complex situation marked by racial hatred which persisted in more subtle forms even after decolonization. The underlying ideology of colonial policies was subjugation and exploitation of the colonized. But what is interesting is that each country found its own style of colonial domination. Each country implemented it in its own way. The British, for instance, used private chartered companies as the mechanism of acquisition of a new colony and justified it largely on the basis of economic returns. The policy of indirect rule was typical of British pragmatism. Indirect rule allowed the powers of the traditional rulers to remain intact so long as it was consonant with imperialism. The French had a different style. We see in the French case a combination of Jacobin tradition and aristocratic romance. The French tradition of centralization and of consistent logic applied to the needs of empire building imposed standardized patterns throughout the French colonies. There was no preference for traditional authority or the primitive chiefs. The education system was along French lines. The curriculum and the schools, all of them in French colonies, were alike. So what is the common goal of colonialism? Clearly it is exploitation, because what lay at the heart of colonialism was the desire to extract as much of resources as possible from the colonies. And that is why we see that the colonial possessions were areas from where raw materials could be sucked out by the metropolitan centers, and then the finished products which were pumped out by these industries could also be siphoned back to the colonies. And in that sense, it was like a double-edged sword, and the colonies were converted into agricultural appendages by the metropolitan centers. Whatever terms one may use to denote the colonial policies of these countries, like Belgium, Portugal, it is clear that they all had one goal, that is exploitation of the people. In the process of colonial rule, The colonial powers obviously had to introduce their own languages. They, of course, introduced railways, they introduced education, but all these were basically meant to buttress the interests of the metropolitan centers. The interest of the colony was never a top priority for the erstwhile masters. These, along with other factors, therefore, gave rise to anti-colonial movements all over the Third World. You will see that in case of India also, the British introduced education, the British introduced railways, but all these developments were basically meant to buttress colonial interests, British interests. And it is paradoxical, and history is full of paradoxes, that all these developments were actually going to boomerang back onto the British, because all these developments, like the spread of education, like the spread of railways, they were actually instrumental to the creation of Indian nationalism, which later contributed to the freedom struggle and helped to emancipate India from the clutches of colonial rule. The economic perspective and the non-economic perspective are two important explanations for colonialism. And we will look at the economic perspective through the views of some important scholars like Hobson. He explains imperialism as an outcome of the capitalist system. The key concept used is underconsumption. Industry looked for foreign markets as it could not find domestic markets for its goods, wages being low. With major industrial powers competing for foreign markets, there was a race for colonies which would serve as captive markets. Hobson concluded that the dominant directive motive behind imperialism was the demand for markets and for profitable investment by the exporting and financial classes within each imperialist regime. He dismissed other motives as secondary because it was mainly the economic interests which propelled the colonial powers to buttress their domination over the colonies. Other notions like power, pride, prestige seemed secondary. Hilferding, in his work Finance Capital, also demonstrated how big banks and financial institutions, in fact, control industrial houses in the last stage of capitalism, better known as finance capitalism. Monopoly capitalists looked to imperialist expansion as a way of ensuring secure supplies of raw materials, markets for industrial goods, and even more avenues for further investment. As each big European power was a monopoly capitalist, economic competition soon became political rivalry, which in turn escalated into war. We also find the economic perspective embellished by Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin. Luxemburg highlighted the unequal relationship between the imperialist powers and the colonies. The European powers gained captive markets and secured profitable avenues for investment. In contrast, the colonies were mere suppliers of raw materials and all kinds of foodstuff. In imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin argued that advanced capitalist countries invest in backward countries because the limits of profitable domestic investment have been reached. The domestic markets get saturated, and then because the industries keep churning out more and more products, obviously they need space to be absorbed, and that is why in the search for new markets, these colonial powers wanted to find markets that could absorb these products, and that is how colonialism happened. Lenin's argument was that the imperialist interests lay behind the rivalries between the European powers that ultimately culminated in the First World War. So it is basically an interpretation of the World War which says that the World War happened only because all these European countries, their domestic markets getting saturated, they were all on the lookout for international markets, and that is how they ended up fighting with one another. But we also find a non-economic perspective to the phenomenon of imperialism. Schumpeter broke away from the leftist paradigm, which located imperialism and capitalism on the same grid. In his scheme, imperialism and capitalism were seen as clearly separate phenomena. Imperialism was atavistic, generated by pre-capitalist forces. In contrast, capitalism was modern, innovative, and productive, and did not control territory in order to prosper. Whereas the writers on the left saw imperialism as an economic system, for Schumpeter, imperialism is the objectless disposition on part of a state to unlimited forcible expansion. So this is basically projected as some kind of a motivation, some kind of a drive, some kind of a disposition, which argument, even when it is credible, is difficult to establish. And that is the problem with this kind of an argumentation. Highlighting the non-economic perspective of imperialism, Gallagher and Robinson questioned the common interpretations of modern imperialism on two counts. They understood the distinction between pre-1870 and post-1870 imperialism to be invalid. Also, imperialism of free trade, informal imperialism, was seen to be as important as formal imperialism. Political expansion was a function of commercial expansion. Trade with informal control if possible, trade with rule when necessary. The political explanation of Fieldhouse is also interesting. The new imperialism was seen as the extension into the periphery of the political struggle in Europe. As the center of the balance was so nicely adjusted that no major change in the status or territory of any side was possible, colonies became a means out of this impasse. So basically, what we find in Fieldhouse's argumentation is that balance of power in Europe, particularly after the age of the Congress of Vienna, offered a safety valve. Colonialism offered a safety valve so that all these European powers, they did not need to nudge each other. Each colonial possession was the avenue where they could buttress and give vent to their expansionist designs. And that is what is highlighted by Fieldhouse. Imperialism can also be seen in terms of the various stages through which it has evolved. The first stage is what we will call mercantilism and early trading empires. The question is, how did Europe emerge as a world leader? If we look at the world in 1500, Europe's dominant position could not be taken for granted. The Ottoman Empire, China under the Mings, India under the Mughals were at the same stage of development. They suffered from one major drawback, however, and that was their domination by a centralized authority which did not provide conditions conducive to intellectual growth. In contrast, the competition between different European powers encouraged the introduction of new military techniques. For example, the long-range armed sailing ship hailed the naval powers of the West to control the sea routes. So you will see that England emerges as the mistress of the seas, and it is by virtue of the discovery of sea routes, coupled to the industrial revolution which had been happening, there was a tremendous surge in production in Europe, and Europe was able to therefore send all her products to different parts of Africa and Asia and Latin America, which were colonized by these metropolitan countries, and that is how colonialism happened. Of course, mercantilism had its advantages. The growth of transatlantic trade was spectacular. It increased eightfold between 1510 and 1550 and almost threefold between 1550 and 1610. Trade was followed by the establishment of the empires and the churches and administrative systems. The shipbuilding industry developed around the major ports of London and Bristol. And I was just telling you that the discovery of sea routes was optimized by the shipbuilding industry, and all these ships sailed across the seas to distant lands in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and converted those areas into colonies, thereby ensuring for themselves the space to grow the raw materials they needed to feed the industries at home. So Britain was poised to colonize. Of the five big European powers, France, Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, Britain soon emerged as the leader, and Britain had several advantages. The first was a developed banking and a financial system. Her geographical location at the westward flank of Europe helped her to maintain a distance from the continent when she wished. The most important factor which gave Britain the edge, of course, was the Industrial Revolution. This enabled the domination of Europe and also the acquisition of colonies. In Porter's words, she was the first frog spawn egg to grow legs, and the first tadpole to change into a frog, the first frog to hop out of the pond. The first empires represented European ambition, determination, and ingenuity in using limited resources rather than European predominance throughout the world. So we definitely come across a phenomenon which we can consider as the Europeanization of world politics. This is interesting because you will find that this dominating role that England exercised and that Europe exercised over the world will gradually take a back seat after the end of the Second World War. The World War had crippled all these European powers. Because of their involvement of the war, all these European countries had been cut to size, and that is why in the post-Second World War period, you find the emergence of two superpowers, and the entire complexion of the world undergoes a change because of the Europeanization of world politics that happens at that juncture. Europe's conquest of America, Africa, and Asia from the 16th century was possible only because of her mastery of the seas. Europe benefited vastly in this era when merchant capital controlled the world economy. Institutions such as the modern state and bureaucracy and the scientific revolution in knowledge laid the foundations of the modern world. When we come to the second stage of imperialism, we mention the important factor of industrial capitalism and the imperialism of free trade. Hobsbawm describes the Industrial Revolution in Britain as that unusual moment in world history when the world's economy was built around Britain, when she was the only world power, the only imperialist, the only importer, the only exporter and foreign investor. The description of Britain as the workshop of the world was literally true in the middle of the 19th century when she produced most of the world's coal, iron and steel. The Industrial Revolution was followed by the single liberal world economy and the final penetration of the underdeveloped world by capitalism. The early British industrial economy relied for its expansion on foreign trade, and overseas markets for products and overseas outlets for capital were also crucial. So the way to British hegemony was through free trade. You will understand that even in case of India, the British had basically come to the shores of India through companies like the East India Company, and thereafter gradually the story of colonialism unfolded as it became more and more deep-rooted. Britain's trade also increasingly became greater with the empire. By 1815, Britain had already become the preeminent world leader, combining naval mastery, financial credit, commercial enterprise, and alliance diplomacy. The following decades of British economic hegemony were accompanied by large-scale improvements in transport and communications, by the increasingly rapid transfer of industrial technology from one region to another, and by an immense increase in manufacturing output, which in turn stimulated the opening of new areas of agricultural land and raw material sources. The age of mercantilism was over, and the new watchword was free trade, and this brought international harmony rather than great power conflict. So we see that imperialism is basically aided by military technology. We have seen that what lay at the heart of colonialism was power. Power that extended itself to the colonies and resulted in the domination of the colonies at all levels, social, cultural, economic, and political. And the ultimate strength was the military strength. Europe's military superiority continued. The improvements in warfare, Maxims and light field artillery constituted a veritable firepower revolution which the traditional societies could not withstand. The decisive new technology, of course, was the gun, and the symbol of European superiority in the armament factory. As Belloc said, whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. So in the long run we find, and in the ultimate analysis, colonialism or imperialism at this stage was definitely backed up by military strength or firepower. With this kind of support extended by military technology, the race for colonies speeded up from the 1880s with the entry of Germany, Italy, and US. These imperialist rivalries, which carved up the world into colonies, semi-colonies, and spheres of influence, also divided Europe into blocs armed to the teeth, the logical corollary of which was the World War. We have already clarified for ourselves that the Leninist interpretation clearly emphasizes how the World War I and II were clearly instances of imperialist warfare, whereby all these powers of Europe were locked in struggle because of their mutual economic rivalries. The final stage of imperialism was finance capitalism. We feel that industrialization spread to several countries of Europe, the US and the Japan, with the result that Britain's industrial supremacy in the world gradually came to an end. I've already referred to how the post-Second World War period led to the de-Europeanization of politics, and that is how the entire complexion of imperialism underwent a change. Most international trade was routed through British ships at the turn of the 20th century. After World War I, British lost this position of supremacy, and gradually we find the emergence of superpowers, and USA, which had so long followed the policy of isolationism, gradually wants to become involved in world politics and emerges as a world leader. Because all these European powers were cut to size by the World War, they were not in a position to maintain colonies anymore. And that is how the story of neocolonialism happened. Imperialism continues in the modern world in a new guise, the guise of neocolonialism. The essential newness of neocolonialism lies in the fact that the country which is dominated through surreptitious, covert, and subtle means and techniques. In case of colonialism, we find that the domination was blunt and blatant. India was in every sense dominated by the British during colonial rule, and there was no India as such. It was basically British India. But in the post-Second World War period, we find that imperialism undergoes a metamorphosis. The European powers are not able to afford colonies anymore, yet they want to retain their control. And that control happens through the use of extremely surreptitious and subtle techniques, which are called techniques of neocolonialism, and which we shall be discussing at length in course of another module. But just for now, let us remember that imperialism can have various forms. Colonialism is one, neocolonialism is another. It need not always manifest itself in the form of colonies. We find imperialism still prevailing in the world, even in an age where there are no colonies, and that is the phenomenon we called neocolonialism. So the end of colonialism does not signify the end of imperialism. Imperialism describes a relationship between a dominant and a subservient society, with the latter being necessarily reduced to a colony. And neocolonialism is a new form of imperialism. Thank you.